page 13 in your notes, and I'll show you the stuff we're skipping, and I'll touch on a few points really quick, and then we're going to hop to page 15 and start actually talking about, the text of Ecclesiastes. So if you look on page 13, you're going to see there are a lot of different views of the book of Ecclesiastes, and a lot of people have obviously very different takes on how to interpret Ecclesiastes. I'll go through a few of these. There's one that basically says it's pessimistic, so the whole book is just kind of a nihilistic approach to life, and everything's meaningless and pointless, and you should be depressed. And so there's kind of that. And as you look at this material, again, this is kind of how, if you watch, so you can go on YouTube and you can watch like Harvard and Yale and some of these places. They will actually post like their seminary class on Ecclesiastes. So you're watching unbelievers teach on the Bible, and they're very knowledgeable and they know what they're talking about, but they basically approach it, it's very pessimistic, it's contradictory, it doesn't flow with anything else in the Bible. Obviously, as we go into this, we're gonna, by faith really, but then our faith is gonna inform our interpretation. By faith, we're gonna look at this and say, you got this point here and this point here, and they agree over here, and this, if you use these key words, you can understand what he means when he says this. And again, there's just a lot of different ways of looking at it, but again, there will be the pessimistic view. I like the way one author put it. He said there's this smell of the tomb about it, just because everywhere you turn in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's death, which is highly encouraging, but that's the way it is. The other view is the fictional view. Several scholars look at Ecclesiastes as a fictional account, so kind of the idea of where it's not really Solomon telling the story, it's someone using Solomon's persona to expound upon his life and make some points, whether they're true or not. Okay. Again, some of these interpretations are possible. I'll explain what I mean. Jesus uses parables all the time. Those aren't real. Those didn't really happen. So he's using illustrations. Now, I don't take this view. I don't think that's an honest way of looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. I do believe it is Solomon doing teaching on his life, so on and so forth. But there you go. There's an optimistic view. They take just a different look, a more moderate view of the word hevel, which, pop quiz, what does hevel mean? Vapor. All right. Can be interpreted, a bajillion different ways, but again, takes a more moderate view of the word hevel. Basically see the author is attempting to have a positive outlook on life. I don't think this is a bad way of looking at Ecclesiastes. One of the points we're going to kind of skip over, Ecclesiastes has a very realistic view of man. Man is fallen, man is going to die, there's not a whole lot of like, yay, man. But one of the things that I find really interesting is Ecclesiastes is basically telling you to enjoy the life that you have. So I think that's that's a very optimistic approach. Basically, you're gonna die someday, so you might as well enjoy the life that you have. No use being miserable. And the premise that goes with, the way you balance that out is, you don't live for pleasure, but if God gives you the ability to enjoy pleasure, then enjoy it. You just don't live for it. So that's kind of a balance point here. But again, life is presented as a gift from God. And so as you get toward Ecclesiastes 11 and some of those things, even Ecclesiastes 3 is going to start talking about the seasons of life. And there's good seasons and bad. There's life, there's death, there's prosperity and poverty. God does those things. So just live with it. It's not a big deal. And so that's an optimistic take. The hedonistic view, and again, you can see how there's aspects of these. Like you could take various bits of this, and that's why as you listen to different teachings through the book of Ecclesiastes, it really depends on what the teacher focuses on. That's really going to shape his interpretation. But the hedonistic view, especially in the beginning of Ecclesiastes, you see Solomon really just living it up. And hedonism is that idea of just live how you want to live, enjoy all the pleasures you want to live for. I don't think this is a great way to interpret Ecclesiastes. Here's why. Because Solomon will repeatedly say, go ahead, live that way, but you're gonna bear the consequences of it. So just be ready. And so he'll tell young men, like, hey, let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth, and go ahead, live in the sight of your eyes, but just understand that youth and all that is vanity. And you're like, oh, that's okay. He's not saying go live in sin, but there is a level of, go ahead, go live your life, enjoy your life, but just understand if you're sinning, God's going to bring it into judgment. You know, that's borne out elsewhere. The apologetic view, some people kind of look at this as Solomon saying, I'm going to give you a reason why you shouldn't just live for pleasure, and what is the end result of all that living for pleasure? You know, I did this and I did that and I did that, and this is the end result of it. Almost the idea of, and this is why we focused on this for an entire summer in teen camp one time, because it's the idea of, if you're young, you obviously have the desire to try out all this stuff. And Solomon's saying, let me just skip to the end. I've tried it all. It doesn't bring any lasting satisfaction. It reminds me of a time I went through a rather messy breakup way back when I was dating, and it wasn't with them. But I went through this frustrating breakup, and I still remember like trying to make it work. And I was sitting across the table from a guy, and he told me the story of someone he had been engaged to, and they broke up. And he said the best thing I ever did was I just finally got over it and I moved on. And I was sitting across the table from him going, well, I mean, that's your story, but my story's different. And so I proceeded to not listen to his counsel, even though I should have. And eventually, when I finally did listen to his counsel, it worked. But I basically proceeded to then spin my wheels for another year, probably. And the funny thing is, I then, later on, had a student who was working for me, and he had just gone through a really messy breakup. And so I sat him down and I said, listen, I know you're not going to listen to me because the guy who told me this I didn't listen to him. And so I'm just going to tell you, this is what you should do. And I know you're not going to listen to me. I told him that. I said, you're not going to listen, but at the end of the summer, when you finally listen, just come back. And yeah, he didn't listen. And at the end of the summer, he came back and he's like, yeah, I should have listened to you. I was like, I know. But that's Solomon. Solomon's coming and he's saying, I mean, he doesn't literally tell us you're not going to listen to me, because some people have. But he's more or less saying, I'm just telling you, I've been here, I've been down this road, I know what you're feeling, I know what you're thinking, I know what you want. Don't do it. It's not gonna bring any lasting satisfaction. All right? And he's just trying to get that across, and obviously people don't listen. All right, and so there's an apologetic view. It's giving a reason for why you should listen, why you should live the way he tells you to live. And again, the under the sun there is intentionally being used to leave God out of the picture for those times. Okay, and then the other way you can look at it, this is also on page 14 if you're following along in the notes, the sovereign God view. This is where I primarily focus. Because again, if you're taking under the sun to have the idea of let's take God out of the picture, whenever you bring that back in, you are drawing attention to the fact that there is a God who is sovereign, who is driving things. So you'll see this. I just take note right here. The wisdom that you have, it provides an advantage, but not a guarantee. Okay, this goes along with what I was telling you guys throughout about. If you compare Proverbs to Ecclesiastes to Job, Proverbs is going to tell you how life works. Proverbs is going to come along and tell you this is, especially like the first several chapters of Proverbs are more just narratives to kind of give you an idea of how life's working. When you get to about Proverbs 9 or 10, that's when you start getting into the actual like little snippet Proverbs that pop up. So I would say if you apply what I'm about to say, apply it to like Proverbs 9 and following. Like that's really where this is going to come into play. Proverbs 1 through 7 is more of like, hey, my son, just listen to this. I saw this kid who did this thing, and this is what happened to him. So just let me just tell you how life works. And then as you get to Proverbs like 9 and 10 and so on, you just get these little snippet proverbs that just tell you how life works. Ecclesiastes is coming along and saying, yes, that's all well and good. Obviously, Solomon would agree with that because he wrote them. And he's coming along saying, that's all well and good. That is how life works. But I'm just telling you, if we understand that God is sovereign, there is going to be situations that disappoint us. There are going to be times where we have lived right. Wisdom has given us an advantage because it's telling us how to live, but it's not a promise that, our life will be wonderful. You then hop to Job, and that's where, as we get into Job, you see his friends really doing I'm going to apply Proverbs to your life situation. And his friends, and this is what I find extremely harsh, like in Job chapter 5, his friends are saying things like, the wicked man is the type of man whose children die by being crushed underneath the gate. And you're like, oh, I know what you're saying there. You're telling Job, who just lost all his children because a building collapsed on them, you must be a wicked man because God promises prosperity to righteous men and that their children will be protected, but the building just fell on your kids, and you know what happens to wicked men's kids? Yeah, they're crushed under the gate. And you're like, oh. And so what I think happens is Solomon is basically saying, there are a bunch of different ways to live your life. There are a bunch of ways to build defenses around your life. Wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the benefit of wisdom is it gives life to those that have it. Now, that is a direct quote out of Ecclesiastes, where he's saying, it is an advantage, it is a protection, but it's not a guarantee. You're not guaranteed popularity if you live wisely. Because he says, there's going to be an old wise man who's in a city, who delivers the city and nobody remembers him. So it's an advantage, but it's not a promise, not a guarantee. All right, you go down through some of this. Wisdom is better than folly, as much as light is better than darkness. But again, death is going to catch up with you. The fate of the fool will overtake the wise man, which is death. What is gained? Well, you probably had a better life if you were wise. Even if that was a shorter life, or even if that was a life that eventually ended in persecution. Still a better life than the fool. So there's a level here of, yeah, the fool can extend his life 1,000 times, twice told, but what does he have to gain for it? Probably nothing, because he's going to die and that's it. But you're going to have this wise man who, he could live 20 years and have a much better life than a fool who lived 1,000. And so he's trying to give us God's perspective, God's value system, God's metric of measuring things. We're very much stuck in our way of measuring things. I really appreciated, I referenced it last time I taught, but Viktor Frankl, he's a guy who lived in a concentration camp. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he tells a story, because, again, his point is if you can figure out why you should live, you can figure out any how. So that's a really cool way of looking at life, where it's if I can figure out why I should be doing this, then I can figure out any how to make it happen. And that's where a lot of times people are like, well, I don't want to do it, so that's why I can't. And they come up with all the excuses in the world to not do it. So if you can figure out why it's important, you can overcome any difficulty pretty much to make that happen. So he tells the story of this woman in his clinical practice who she had 2 sons. One was extremely handicapped, the other one was healthy. And her healthy son died. And so she was planning to commit suicide, her with the handicapped son, because she just couldn't handle the loss of her healthy son. Well, the son, who was handicapped, basically pled with her mom, I don't want to die, and basically convinced her to not commit suicide. And so he's sitting in there with a group of them, and they're talking about what they should live for. And there's this one woman who's pursuing basically the career path, and there's that woman there with her handicapped son, and he says, all right, I want you to fast forward to you're 80 years old, you're about to die, and you're looking back on life. What are you thankful for? And so he basically looked at the lady who was thinking about living for a career, and he said, you're 80 years old, you have no kids. Looking back, what do you regret? Well, I regret the fact that I had no kids to pass any of this on to. So now I die and everything dies with me. So he looks at the woman who had the handicapped kid, and he says, basically, you wouldn't look back and regret the fact that you had a kid. Like you have a kid, you have someone to carry on after you, handicap or not. Like, this is a woman who lives for finances and money, and she is actually looking back and saying, I regret I don't have any kids, because she just lived for herself. But you actually have someone to pour into, you have someone to invest in, and that actually will be something you look back on fondly. It was just, again, that doesn't work for everyone, but it's just kind of a thought process. He said, you should live your life as if you're living it for a second time and you've done everything wrong the first time. And it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, because what it is it's saying you're looking at a decision. You're looking at choices you have to make. You do a mental exercise of what happens if I make this series of wrong choices. What happens to me? And you basically send out this little fake you to go die. and obviously you don't do it yourself, unless you're stupid. But you send out your fake self, they die, and you go, I'm not doing that. now you get to do it again the right way. And so that's, again, play those mental exercises sometimes. Like when you're about to make a decision in like the spur of the moment, when you're frustrated and like, I just want to do something bad because I don't care anymore. Just play the mental exercise. All right, where's this path going to take you? What's going to happen to you if you keep down this path? Because Solomon basically says, if you go down this path, you die. Now, ultimately, if you go down the wise path, you die too, but you just die better. So Solomon's saying, die good. All right. You see here, wise youths, they gain advancement, but there is no lasting solution. It's a temporary profit. Because we don't know the future, we should be willing to take chances and take risks. Take a look at this one. This is kind of fun. This is one that encouraged me, one summer camp that I was doing. I don't know how I hadn't seen it before. I guess I hadn't studied Ecclesiastes much before that summer. But look at Ecclesiastes chapter 11. It says this, cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it again after many days. Give portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree fall toward the south or the north, in the place where the tree falleth, there it shall be. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. For thou knowest not the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child. Even so thou knowest not all the works of God who maketh all. In the morning sow thy seed, in the evening withhold not thy hand. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. All right? And so you see basically a summary here. He's saying, there are all sorts of excuses you could make to not take chances. It's getting a little cloudy out. It would be like us. We're planning a youth rally. We're looking at the weather, and 2 days ago it was like 85% rain. I think yesterday was like 10% rain. I don't know what it's going to be today. But the fact is, we could basically say, oh, youth rally is going to be miserable. It rains. Let's just cancel now. And you know what? It could rain, or it could not. You have no idea. So you just take your chances and you do your thing. But there's a lot of people who they're so afraid to take any risk because they think it all depends on them. And that was what encouraged me one summer camp, because I was like, hey, I'm taking a risk. I'm working at camp for the summer. I'm going to see how God works. And you know what? Give portion to 7 and also to 8. Cast your bread on the waters. It'll come back to you. It's just take your risks. Don't worry about it. Now, obviously, if it's a risk that there is no chance I could recover this. Okay. But that's where wisdom comes in. But there is a level of risk here, but God works things out. Again, probability and chance happen. Ecclesiastes 10 talks about life has risks. So again, there's just a lot of stuff there to that. Now, as we summarize Ecclesiastes, before we get into the actual text itself, Ecclesiastes and Genesis, they kind of agree with one another. And this is how it works. They both exhibit substantial agreement on the central point of what we call the creation motif. So this idea of creation, that creation is good, creation is something that should be celebrated. When's the last time you thought that way? That the world around us is something that is good and something we should enjoy and celebrate. Like our tendency, and I know if you go to national parks or other things, you're like, this is amazing. If you stick with SARS class, you're like, whoa, and there's no doubt that's good. But have you ever just thought, we live in a good world? The world around us is good. Now, it is sin cursed. The people are often evil. But we live in a good world, and we can enjoy the world around us. Don't worry about it. But there's a lot of times where we just kind of write off the world. Oh, well, that's just evil. Oh, it's just bad. It's just wicked. And again, it's cursed, but it is a good creation of God. There's 7 times in the opening chapters of Genesis that God looks at his creation and calls it good. Similarly, Koheleth, which is the name for the author of Ecclesiastes, he views life and says we should eat and drink, and that our soul should enjoy the good of his labor, and I saw that this was from the hand of God. So there's a level here where work itself is good. Striving is good, not like fighting, but working toward an end is good. It's not oh man, I got to go to work because it's the curse. It's no, work pre-existed the curse. You were working, and that's just part of life. And so there's a level here. I find it amazing if you study out early history. The monks and those people who were in the monasteries, they realized that work was just something that was good to do. So even though they had taken vows of poverty and things like that, they were striving to do good work, quality work. And their work was so good that as they started selling things, they realized like tons of money was coming back in. And so they would pour that money back into producing more. And I mean, it was like this feedback loop of like, that's why they got so rich, but they didn't keep the money. And so there were technological advancements, and there were other things that they pursued, because it was like, well, we're supposed to work, and work is really, really good. And so we're making all this money that we have basically said we're not going to keep. So might as well dump it right back in and make it better. And that's just kind of that feedback. But they understood work is a good thing. It's not a product of the curse. And so there's a lot of aspects of creation that we kind of summarize and are like, oh, this is just bad. But it's actually good. And so there's just a lot of it there. Now, as we get into the text of Ecclesiastes itself, all right, take a look at page 15 in your notes. All right. There we go. All right, gonna have to go the slow way. All right, so on page 15, we start getting into the actual text of Ecclesiastes. Now, we've covered a good bit of Ecclesiastes, whether you realize it or not, because we've just been touching on little chapters here and there. But as we get into the original naming of Ecclesiastes, its original name would have been Koheleth. Basically, it means the masters of assembly, the guy who's kind of calling together a group of people and teaching them. So that's just imagine like you guys are my assembly, because you are, and I am the Koheleth. And that's basically the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you think about the name for the church is the ecclesia, the assembly. All right? So as you think about this, that's basically what Ecclesiastes means. It doesn't mean the church, but it means the assembly. Like, I'm talking to the assembly. So as we talk about it, he is the gatherer or the disperser of wisdom. So what he's doing is he's collecting all of this wisdom from all over the place. I told you a few lessons ago, as you look at Solomon, he did collect wisdom from, Egypt and other places. And so there's some proverbs that as you look down in Egypt, you're like, oh, that's almost the exact same proverb. It is, because he married Pharaoh's daughter. Don't you think he would have gotten a few things from Egypt? Like, that's not astounding to consider, because Solomon had trade routes everywhere. He had materials flowing in from everywhere. Don't you think he got something from other countries that he was like, ooh, that's a good piece of wisdom right there. I'm going to keep it. I remember my first time I was directing teen camp. I was reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And, I was like, might as well learn how to war, because teen camp. And, but there would be things where it was like, where'd you get that, Sun Tzu? Why? Because it's actually kind of wise. And so what Solomon is, I'm not saying Sun Tzu's in the Bible, but what Solomon is doing is he's pulling wisdom from all over the place, and he's more or less saying, all right, this matches with God's revealed truth. This one matches with God's revealed truth. This one matches God's revealed truth. And you'll see that. There are plenty of times in the Bible where they'll reference things that aren't the Bible. Jude does it, First Peter does it, Paul does it all the time. He knows the wisdom of the area around him, and he's pulling the parts of it that match God's truth. And he puts it in the Bible and says, just so you know, this is a quote from such and such. And some of those sources we still have, some of them we don't have anymore. So we're kind of going, I think. But again, it's not unbiblical to say you could pull wisdom from non-biblical sources, because we can tell what matches God's truth and what doesn't. And that's basically what Solomon's doing. Now, the other option, maybe he didn't pull from Egypt at all. Maybe Egypt pulled from him. That is an entire plausible option. Again, we don't know, but the scholars, who obviously know everything, the scholars would say he's pulling from Egypt, and let's just, for the sake of argument, say they're right. That's not a problem. That's the only point I'm trying to make there. Now, like I said, from the Greek, we get this word ecclesia, or Ecclesiastes, which is a translation of the title. Now, as we get into Ecclesiastes, the first part is really focused on this idea of hevel of heavens. It's the vanity of vanities. It's that whole word that we spent a whole lot of time studying so far, so we're going to move pretty close. My typo is fun. He's pronouncing judgment that all is supposed to be hevel, not he, but everything's a he. So everything is hevel, and that's what he's trying to say. All right, and so as you start here in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, that is his point. He's saying everything you could possibly imagine, everything you could focus on is ultimately going to have a healthy dose of hevel buried in it. He's going to get into discussing profit. Now, that's the Hebrew word yithron. I probably butchered the pronunciation. But it's the idea of profit. What profit hath the man for all the labor he takes? And you'll notice as you read Ecclesiastes, he's going to transition from the idea of profit into good. You know, what is profitable to what is good. And so you'll see a transition as you read it and what he's doing. Profit, in short, is gain, surplus, what's left after. And so as he summarizes the book, he's basically saying, all right, so I have all this wisdom. Well, what's left over afterwards? Pretty much nothing. I have all this wealth, but when I die, what's left over afterwards? Pretty much nothing. And so the idea of what profit do you have, it's kind of the, well, not a whole lot. Now, it benefited your life for while you're alive, but if that's all you're living for, then it dies with you. And that's kind of the idea. He's going to get into a discussion of labor and work. So you'll see that all, verse 3, what profiteth a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. So he's just talking about all these things that you could build, all the monuments you could achieve, everything you could live for. Ultimately, if that's all you're living for, it's going to wear away and die, and that's it. As he continues, he's going to talk about the cyclical nature of life. This is going to play out in chapter 1. It's going to play out in a very popular song and a very popular poem in chapter 3, which the authors of the song, "There is a season, turn, turn, turn," they, if I remember the story correctly, they gave most of the money of the song to the Jews because they're like, they wrote the song anyway. And so they wrote a song called "Turn, Turn, Turn," and it is directly quoting Ecclesiastes 3. It is hilarious. If you listen, you're like, just take your Bible, put on the song, and you're like, that's funny. Now, Solomon doesn't say turn, 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 between everything. But they basically, they've ripped off an entire chapter of Ecclesiastes to talk about how cyclical life is. And so that's part of it. So as you look at it, it talks about the earth, and it says, the earth is here, even the sun, and all that the sun does, where it rises and sets, and then it just resets the next day and does it again. And so this is not him trying to say the sun goes around the earth. I think you all understand that. What he's simply saying is just the appearance. The sun is just like, boop, boop. If you wanted to get over scientifically literal, you could we are actually progressing slowly through the darkness of space. And actually the sun is moving and the entire solar system is moving, so things have been accomplished. And it's like, yes, I know. But from an earthly perspective, all that progress that the sun makes across the sky, the next day it just does it again. And so he's not trying to be overly literal, but I have seen entire books written on passages like that to prove geocentricity. That's not the point of what he's trying to say. All right, so as you try to interpret the scripture, you have to be careful to make sure you know when he uses this illustration, is he trying to be overly literal, or is he trying to just say, from a human perspective? So just not trying to be too sardonic with this, but I have seen people go very, very far in there, like, ooh, look at the science of this. And it's like, well, he's not trying to make a scientific statement. Now, sometimes they do, because when you're telling the truth, there are times where you notice things scientifically, like Proverbs 6 talks about, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, because it's the females who are doing most of the work. Some things aren't any good. But what he's doing is he's basically saying, like, hey, the female ant's doing the work. Did I know it was female? I don't know, but he says her. But don't read too much into it, because if you find one male ant that's doing work, you're like, oh, the Bible's wrong. That's not the point of the passage. The point of the passage is to say, look at the ant, dummy. It's working. But it said her. Yeah, because the female does the work. But if you find a male doing work, it's not a contradiction. He didn't say he never does any work either. So just be very honest with the text. Don't take it farther than it was meant to go. All right? It says, the wind goeth toward the south, it whirleth about toward the north, it whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits, which there is a wind cycle. The rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the waters come, thither they return again. the water cycle. So you've got wind cycles, water cycles, rock cycles, all these things work where basically something turns into something else and eventually it turns back into the thing it came from, and you just have these cycles. And his point is, sure, you have this amazing mountain that came, ripping up out of the ground, but eventually it's going to wear its way down and it won't be a mountain anymore and a new mountain will rise up, and that's just life. So you could build a giant monument and you'll be like, yeah, I built the giant monument ever. And then it falls over and they find like its toe in an ocean. And you're like, ooh, that was a big statue. I wonder what it said. Nobody knows because it fell over. So you could set up the giant, like Colossus of Rhodes or something like that. You could set up a giant statue. Earth shakes a little bit and the thing falls over and you find pieces of it in the water. Okay, that's life. It's cyclical. All right, and so those are just some of the cycles. Even each generation just kind of comes and goes. You forget the generation before. I think it's probably been about 4 or 5 cycles of students have gone through Pensacola since I left. And those people who are like really popular at college, and then like within a cycle they're forgotten and nobody knows, and then within 2 cycles, unless they're a teacher or something, nobody even knows them. And I had a guy who I was friends with who was an assistant pastor of the church there. But so many cycles have gone now that he's probably even forgotten. And so you think about every position of authority, every position of prominence, you go through enough cycles and people completely forget you. What profit is there to that thing? Well, I was in Who's Who. Who? Who cares? But that's like a big thing where people are like, I got this prestigious thing. And it's like, nobody cares. Not really. I mean, like the people who are around you might, but then within a few years, they're not going to look back and be like, oh, you're that Who's Who guy. They don't care. It's just how it is. But there are people who they stick with that like one achievement, and they're like, yeah, I'm that guy. And people are like, and so he's just saying, generations come and go. I mean, you think about all the rich, famous, wealthy people and prosperous people who we don't even know their name. We know like one of them. It's like, oh, Solomon. Yeah, but who was the king of Egypt that time? I don't know. Who was the king of Greece? Didn't exist. But who were these people? I don't know. We know like one guy. And that's this idea. The generations come and go. Even nature, things like sun, wind, water, earth, labor, they all have their cycles. And they come and go and they're forgotten. And that's why he keeps stressing this idea of profit. What profit is there under the sun? There is no lasting legacy. And in short, Solomon is introducing his book with this idea that there is no lasting legacy or change, even from the wise or the wealthy. So he's using that to say, okay, so what are you going to live for? What is the purpose of your life? Because most of the things you're going to do with your life are going to be forgotten. I find it really cool. Mark, the pastor who was here last year, the deaf pastor, if any of you know, he sent me some pictures of the pool, from I think probably back in the 70s or 80s. It looked very, very different. Didn't have the fence around it. It's kind of cool. I was like, wow, that's totally different looking. But you can imagine what a guy like that, or even Martin or Barbara Slagle, has seen at a camp like this. I think, John, if I remember your story right, this used to have the same type of paneling of some sort at one point, and then it was removed, and then we put it back. It looks amazing, but who knows? 20 years from now, someone else might come along and be like, "Oh, that looks terrible," and rip it all out, and all of our hard work that we spent hours and hours and hours doing is thrown in a trash pile because someone comes along and says, "That's terrible." I mean, you think about the lodge rooms and the things that we've been remodeling, and you think that there was someone at one point who newly remodeled that, built that all in place, and thought it looked really good. And then we come along, 20, 30 years later and go, wow, that is really dated looking. We need to fix that. Rip it all out, throw it all in the trash pile, redo it all. That happens with everything. And so there's this level of, if you are resting on just those type of things to say, that's my purpose in life, you're just going to be sorely disappointed. There is an autobiographical section. So as you get into the end of chapter 1, into chapter 2, Koheleth is going to start looking at everything under the sun, and he's trying to figure out the Yithron, the prophet that there is. He's very intentional. So as we look through this, he's not just like a hormonal teenager going through like a party phase. It's more of the idea of, I think he probably was doing some of it to enjoy it. But as he recounts it, he's very intentionally saying, I made mistakes. There's things I sought after. My wisdom remained with me. So it wasn't like I lost my mind. My wisdom remained with me, and I just want to tell you how it turned out. So he's going to start telling things. So he talks about all the things that a man can explore, all the work that a man can do. And he says, but there are aspects that I just can't figure out. So under the sun, there is a level of, there's no figuring this out. So you can try. The Bible said it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of kings to search out a matter. So there is a level of where God is going to conceal things, but it's glorious for us as humans to say, we are going to strive to figure this out. I use the illustration a lot. There are aspects of the Bible that are like trying to explain physics to a 2-year-old. God is trying to explain things to us by stooping down to our level and explaining things in our language. It's hard to understand, and it takes work, and it takes effort, and it takes striving. As we continue, he's continuing to kind of go through his life story. He says all is ruach, or vexation of spirit. It's all just wind. I try to catch it. I try to control it. I just can't. He says another way of looking at this, he's like, I can't catch the wind. He gives proverbs describing the problem. You can't straighten out what God has bent. You can't count what God has concealed. If you want to see this one, look at the end of chapter 1. Let's see. So verse 8, he says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which hath been is that which shall be. That which is done is that which shall be done. There is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old times, which was before us. There is no remembrance of the former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of the things that are to come hereafter. I, the preacher, was king over Jerusalem. I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail that God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under heaven, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked. All right, so you think of something that's all messed up. He said that which is crooked. Basically, if God has made something crooked, it cannot be made straight. And that which is wanting cannot be numbered. And so he's saying there are things that God hath done that we just can't undo. There's nothing we can do about it. So we have to choose to live in light of what God has done. I think this year has been a perfect illustration of that. That there are things that God has done where he's saying, yes, pandemic, riots, protests, weird election things, all of that is just going to be thrown into your lap. You're going to have to cope with it. You're going to have to work your way through it. But you do have to understand that I am in charge of this mess. I know what I'm doing. But there is nothing you can do to say, COVID, go away. Go away. And he's like, no, it's here. It's going to happen. And you just live with it. And you choose how you live with it. You know, election results, go away. I don't know what you're doing. Just leave me alone. That's not an option. You live with it. And in some other cultures, there's a famine that just rolled in. There's a war that just rolled in. And your city got burned down. There are things that are crooked that we cannot make straight. We're almost at the mercy of other people's bad choices. That's just life. So any level, your kids are at the mercy of your bad choices. You are at the mercy of your boss's choices. The boss is at the mercy of the government. The government is at the mercy of whoever took over the government secretly. Whatever. But there's certain levels of we don't have any control over that. So you trust to the sovereignty of God, and you don't try to fight it. He says this, I communed with mine own eyes, saying, lo, I am come to great estate. I have gotten more wisdom than all they that were before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this is also vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. And so as wisdom increases, frustration increases, because you know how it's going to end. And that's where I say it's frustrating to be at the mercy of other people's bad choices, because you know how it's going to end, and you're going, yay, I don't want to be on this ride, but I'm stuck on it. All right? I don't know if it's in your notes, but this comic I found fun. And it's just the idea of those who know history are doomed to repeat it, or those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, but those who do are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. And that's just how it is. And so that's where there are aspects that God has done something, and I remember I have an unsaved friend. I remember sending this verse. It's out of Daniel, where it talks about Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar, or one of those guys, or maybe it's Belshazzar, and he says, God sets over nations the basest of men. And I was just like, hey, ain't this true? And it was just kind of that idea of like, you think about our leaders, and we're all like, well, the leaders should be honorable and noble. And the Bible's like, God sets over nations the basest of men. And you're like, yeah, that's true. And it doesn't take much searching to go, look at all the quote-unquote great world leaders for the last 100 years. And you're like, most of them are just terrible people. That's life. God sets over nations who he chooses to set over them. Sometimes their leaders are a punishment to them. And he's trying to punish them. And so he's like, hey, I'm going to give you an absolute terrible leader because that's what you deserve. And those of us who are like, but we tried to stop it, we're caught up with it. And that's just coping with what God does and trusting him in it. All right, the identity of the author, as you continue with this, it is the king in Jerusalem. Another typo there, it shouldn't say king is Jerusalem. That'd be odd. But the king in Jerusalem, he is wiser than all previous kings. Now, this is why some people struggle with saying this is actually Solomon, because if you think about how many other kings there were before him in Jerusalem, there was exactly one, David. So it's not really a big claim to be like, hey guys, I was wiser than any king before me in Jerusalem. Who? David. So that's just kind of like, that is a really good question though, Emma. Saul actually didn't rule in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became David's capital. So it's just kind of like, now you could say, I think it was the Jebusites who had it before them. So you could say like, he's wiser than any of their kings. And Jerusalem goes back well before Israel. So you could make the case that he's talking about that, or, maybe he's just speaking, with hyperbole to say, all right, any king that comes, I'm wiser than them. Again, but that is actually one of the points that people will go to say, this is someone in the exile period using Solomon's name to try to say, like, I'm wiser than any king in Jerusalem. Because at that point, there had been a ton. So I don't go there, but there you go. Solomon will set out to gain a lot of wisdom in order to understand life, and ultimately his purpose will be he's going to apply his heart to know all the different things you can know, whether it's wisdom, insanity, folly, all of that, and he's basically summarizing it all by saying it's all vapor. So there you have it. That is pretty much all of chapter 1, and we'll move a little quicker next time because chapters 2 and 3, et cetera, move on from there pretty quick. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions or comments.